worked. Holy
We're
crap, this is
live.
so cool. Hey there.
Hey, John, nice to digitally meet you, even though
I
I feel like I've been
know.
watching you for ages.
Yeah, same here. That's awesome. I've never done this before. This is very cool.
Yeah. I did live once with my friend Yellow Eleanor, who's another great mushroom person, and we kind of chatted about mushroom stuff. But it's funny because I've gone live a lot on TikTok because I feel less pressure or stress there for some reason.
I mean, I feel like TikTok is just in general less stressful as a place.
As a platform, yep.
Yeah. I mean, Instagram, like there are just some people on Instagram that I'm just glad don't have TikTok in general, because I just rather not.
Yeah, it's fine. I mean, what I think is really interesting is the way that certain creators have blown up on TikTok, become verified, they have millions of followers, and you look at their Instagrams, they have like 6,000 followers or something like that, and it's such a different way to build your following and the way.
And I think I appreciate the fact that like TikTok is a lot more, I don't even want to, forgiving is not the right word for it, but it's more focused on personality as well, and like authenticity, which I appreciate, because like Instagram is very much like based on aesthetic and stuff, and if you find a niche and you're like one of the pioneers of that niche, that's great, but like it's really hard to like get a foot in Instagram on your own from the ground up. At least recently. Yeah.
It took me like 3.5 years to really, I mean, at least get some momentum. And, I grew because I was able to work with guys like the Science Channel and have my content posted by BuzzFeed and things like that.
Yeah.
Otherwise I would still have, 5,000 followers and no one would have any idea who I am. But so, I mean, speaking of niche, I guess like my niche is clearly mushroom shit, which is, has been funny because my background is actually, I'm a PhD biochemist who learned a lot about wine stuff and fermentation of yeast and alcohol type related things. And I did that for like 10 years trying to build a career in the wine industry. And I spent like 2 years posting pictures of mushrooms, and suddenly I'm famous for mushrooms. So
that is awesome. And like, I love them. like the way that you post them too is like, they're very, very beautiful, and they're very beautiful, like in unexpected ways. Like they're because especially when it comes to things like fungus and like the slime pictures that you put up there, is like they're just like well shot too. So it's like it's very easy to appreciate mushrooms through your lens, I'd say.
And I appreciate that. I'm trying to get people to be hopefully as passionate, or at least, so many people are afraid of mushrooms. And I think, you probably run into that. You come from at least a culinary background where mushrooms are valued, and it's not, everyone is like, oh, I hate mushrooms, I don't like mushrooms. Like, you've probably only ever eaten like a cremini, a white button mushroom, and a portobello. Did you know all three are the same species? Like, you've only ever eaten one kind of mushroom.
Well, at least that's why I'm very appreciative of like having like upbringing in Asian food, because like, or Chinese food specifically, like we'll eat anything literally. So it's like we're like not afraid whether like the Whittier mushroom or Whittier fungus, snow fungus is like one of my favorite ones to do, because like we use them in desserts, and like that's such a foreign concept to people, like even using mushrooms for like sweet applications. Like,
totally.
And wild.
I've done a couple of things, like messed around with, there's these things called yellowfoot chanterelles. You're familiar with like a chanterelle, which is sort of big, relatively meaty yellow one. So that's a cantharellus species. There's also craterellus, which are these like smaller, hollow tubed chanterelles called yellowfeet. And I've done something where you just basically boil them down in syrup. Confit them in a syrup kind of thing, and it sounds weird, but they have this like light buttery texture that when you have them like deep down in a nice caramelized syrup, they're out of control good.
I'm into it.
And I've even seasoned that with a little bit of this. There's this other mushroom, and actually I did this because I sent a couple other TikTok chefs some mushroom care packages, and I want to send one to you because I think you know what to do with them. There's this mushroom called candy caps. Lactarius rubidus, and maybe you've heard of it, but it has this like maple like aroma because it has the lactone sodalon, which has this incredible maple aroma. You can make anything just stink of maple by putting some mushrooms in it.
Really?
Super cool.
No, I've never heard of this, and I would love to get my hands on some of that for sure.
Yeah, man, I'll definitely put something together for you. But I guess so I think we're on my feed, so we get a lot of like mushroom people as opposed to me being on your feed where you've got people just plastering you with cooking questions. Do you want to like give yourself a little pitch on like your culinary background and like teach me too about where you came from into food and mushrooms and anime, all the things?
And I'm like very, very glad to be here. And like I'm also very fascinated to see like what your follower base is like what like fans of mushrooms are like, period, in general. But like my background, I'm a chef in Detroit. I got my start off doing I've been cooking for close to like 8 or 9 years now, but not really on any kind of conventional path. I started as a home cooking food blogger, and that kind of evolved into me doing some of like the first pop-ups that ever happened to Detroit. And because of Detroit was what it was in like 2008 and 2009, there was just a lot of empty space. So like by pop-ups, we would take over cafes that were abandoned and like do weekly things over there. So there was like a lot of opportunity for me to learn about the industry in a very unusual way. And that grew into meeting chefs. Once Detroit was starting to become more popular and have more development, chefs started to come over. Well, a lot of them came from Michigan or Metro Detroit, left for places like Chicago and New York, and then started coming back to open restaurants. When they came back, there was like a shortage of people who knew how to cook anything, and they needed help doing their pop-ups and stuff like that. So I got to know them that way, worked at some of their restaurants, and now I'm like on track to I'm on construction right now to build my own restaurant here in the city.
That's super cool.
Yeah, it was great. I mean, like everything from just like popping up in abandoned homes to like doing pop-up food halls in abandoned like factory areas and stuff like that, and then that normally would turn into like techno dance festivals. Like it was
that sounds like
it was a very, very good time. It was a very good time. So there was a lot.
So did you not have a official culinary background, like no official culinary training?
No, I never went to culinary school or anything like that.
And me neither. I cook a lot, and I'm very serious about food. I think you and I could look at each other's book collections and be like, this guy knows what is up. But yeah, I never had a formal thing, and that's a lot of people think they can only do something if they have the formal training. So I just want to
and I think like cooking is one of those things where it's like it really does do a good job of like showing people like you don't need to have formal training to be it helps. I'm not saying I'm not saying to anybody who's like thinking about going to school, culinary school, that's completely useless. It's not. All of the chefs that I worked for did go to culinary school, but no, there's not a chef out there that at any like fine restaurant or restaurant that we've heard of that thinks that that's the only way, that's the only pathway. Like you can start from dishwasher and work yourself up to head chef. That is still possible if you care enough.
It's not a prerequisite for success. At least you can still, and I think that's, for me, that's really interesting because, I was saying my background, I got a PhD in yeast and wine fermentation stuff, but I had zero background in mushrooms. Right. And I came into this, and I was living in New Zealand with my partner. She was at a winery working like 14-hour days, and I got bored. So I started going out for hikes, and I started taking photos. And I was just like, what? As a kid, I'd been sort of interested in mushrooms, but I'd forgotten about them for 20 years or something. And suddenly I had like hundreds of photos of mushrooms on my phone. I was like, what do I do with all of these? So I started an Instagram, and immediately I started getting feedback from people. And it was just amazing how something that I felt like I had no background and no real knowledge about, and just reading about it every day and thinking about it, and kind of what you do with food. When you get really into food, you start cooking all the time. Right. You start reading, you start watching, all of this stuff. And it's amazing how quickly you can evolve from being somebody who knows nothing into suddenly somebody who's considered an expert.
Right. And it's like, and I think like that's the beauty of working with things like things that you can eat, whether it be mushrooms or like cooking in general and stuff like that, it's something that you have to do like every day. So if you're going to incorporate something that you're passionate about into it, you can find yourself to like, you can educate yourself on the topic much more quickly than you could like any kind of like strictly academic topic. I mean, cooking at the end of the day, it's a craft and a trade. So you need to do it. That's the only way that you can master it. You can't just like read on it and then become an expert. It's motor skills, just like anything else. But
I mean, at the same time, it's also very scientific, and I think that was one of the things that I've like really started taking seriously when I saw this book.
Yes, the book.
So for
if anybody like who's like in the room, like this is like the quintessential text and tome on like the science and food, physics and chemistry of cooking.
So it's called it's backwards on the thing, but it's called On Food and Cooking. What is it? The Science and Lore of the Kitchen, and this is by the author Harold McGee. And so the thing I didn't like tell you on Instagram because it just felt like bragging, but Harold McGee is like an old family friend.
Are you serious?
Yeah.
What?
My parents are friends with him like way back in the day when they lived in Chicago or something like that. So actually when I was like trying to consider what schools to go to, when I was trying to figure out if I should go to UC Davis, I like had a long conversation with Harold McGee and was like, hey, and I call him Hal, but I was like, hey Hal, should I like go to Davis? And he's like, yeah, that sounds reasonable. You know, go ahead, do a PhD. Which is hilarious now because like many years later, he's a board member at the UC Davis, what's called the Robert Mondavi Institute of Food and Wine Science, where there was sort of the subsection where I got my PhD at Davis. So he's a big part of board member and like helps them make decisions about who to hire and how to spend money and that kind of stuff. So I see him every once in a while.
That is incredible.
Yeah. And then one time actually I was in, this was like years ago, but I was in SF when Chris Cosentino still had his old place. And I was there I ate an entire plate of pig's livers and cream sauce or something like that. Chris Cosentino does all the weird offal. But Hal was there. It was his like neighborhood restaurant. So I'm sitting there eating and like Hal walks in and I was like, oh, hey, Hal. And like Chris, and I'm like, he was kind of sitting at the bar and Chris Cosentino's looking at me like, what the fuck is this kid like?
Oh my gosh. Just no, and NBD, friends with royalty, whatever, it's fine.
I mean, you know, we're not super close or anything like that, but I know the guy enough to call him on a first name.
Yeah, but I would never call him Hal if I saw it.
Yeah, well, and I think there's been a couple times when I've said that and people are like, who are you talking about? Oh, Harold. I'm like, okay, sorry, yeah, right, formal. Curious. Hey, for anyone who's curious, this On Food and Cooking, Harold McGee is also an author. I think he writes for the New York Times as the Curious Cook. He's had a couple other books that have come out. He's awesome. But I guess curious because I grabbed a few other books off my shelf. Just like, do you have anything else, other books that like had huge impacts on you? You know, especially since you're self-trained, so you had to kind of acquire that knowledge yourself, right?
That one, I mean, the ones that I would read, I mean, a lot of. I used cooking as kind of a way as finding my way back to like my culture, being like a third culture kid, Chinese kid raised abroad. So Eileen Tan, for a lot of her cookbooks, she does a lot of like home cooking Chinese cookbooks, and then Fuchsia Dunlop, who is like the English speaking and writing authority on any type of Chinese, on pretty much all of the 8 different types of Chinese cuisine, because like she's just so well studied in it. So I probably hers, but I try not to. I have a lot of books that I'll skim and I'll use them more as like reference materials as opposed to go through them.
Yeah, I don't actually read my books. I just flip open. And,
at first I used to, and then I found that it was like becoming more of an influence on like my style than I wanted to. And I was kind of like afraid of just like absorbing too much of someone else's creative process as opposed to just like keeping or like safeguarding my own, especially like earlier on when I was like super impressionable by anything, like, you know, Chef's Table like meant everything to me. And like, now I'm just like, God, I'll never want to see another episode of that show again. But because like I just really don't care about fine dining at all. But at first, like everybody, when you start off in food, sometimes you get stuck in that where it's like, you know, that level whatever that means. It's just like that level of pomp. People gravitate to pomp, it seems.
I mean, there's something to be said for having the experience, especially as a consumer, because I think like I'm just thinking back to summer of 2008, maybe. I went to Spain and spent like a whole month eating tapas. And it was the most incredible. If anyone doesn't know, Spain is all about these sort of small plates, and you go from bar to bar and you walk in and it's like 2-3 euros for a plate of like fried peppers or shrimp or mussel, you know, some sort of delicious little snack, high impact drinking food, basically. And often they'll even give you like a little beer to go with your snack kind of thing. And there's pinchos, there's plates everywhere. You just point and like, I want that and that and that. And you go to a next place and do it all over again. And you can stay until like 3 a.m. just doing that all the time.
I remember in like 2000, I think it was like 2000, I want to say 2005 or 6 when tapas was like a huge thing in the States, and every restaurant had tapas. And I remember going to, it was like a Chinese pop-up here. And somebody was like, oh, we do Asian style tapas. And I was just looked at the server and I was like, do you mean dim sum? Is that what you're trying to say? It's like, it was just such a fad word that everybody was throwing around all over the place.
Right. And it's funny because small plate dining is a lot of fun, but I mean, I think the biggest issue in America with small plate dining is that the whole point of tapas is to like hit and eat and go, without ever really sitting down. You don't pay a bill. You just kind of throw cash at a guy. He takes it and you choose whatever you want. And in America, it's like everyone's like, well, I can go to a restaurant and order a bunch of small plates, but then I walked out of there spending like $120 and I'm still freaking hungry.
Right.
Like, how is that? You know, that's not worth it. So it's really, we need like a whole neighborhood, a sector, a place where you can go and wander around and do that kind of eating. We don't have that night market mentality or that small plate mentality widely spread enough to really, or densely concentrated enough in most cities to like make that kind of thing happen.
And I don't think up until recently, I don't think, by and large, like Americans really had that curiosity when it comes to food. We certainly might now, but like our American interest in anything like when it comes to food is very, very recent to me. Like, you know, like I don't think, I really do think it started with like the millennial generation actually giving a shit about what they ate in any kind of capacity. I certainly don't think the generations before us, because like that was all just like processed food and convenience back then.
Well, yeah, I mean, there was, I think World War II, if you look at like the history of the United States and the food cultures in the United States, there was a lot of immigrant food cultures that came over, and some of those things are still sort of alive and well in little micro areas. But World War II and the 50s caused this mass homogenization and the rise in canned and processed and microwave and frozen and all that stuff. And it's only been in the last like 20 years that Americans have been like, oh, what's a farmer's market? And I mean, not necessarily that organic produce is that much better than conventional, but just people having interest in what am I putting in my body.
Right.
And I think it's, in some ways it's been fueled by like weird dietary trends, you know, gluten-free and keto and all these other things. And it's like, I don't subscribe to any of those diets, but at least people are paying more attention to what they're eating. And sometimes it means they want to actually eat something better than what they were eating.
As like a chef, like I'm glad the interest came, because like even like it was, convenience was so ingrained in as a top priority when it comes to like American consumption of food, that we actually like were growing. And you as a science person know this, like where we were growing our crops based to serve that convenience, like grocery store tomatoes, and like how just depressingly soulless and lifeless they are, but that we grow them and we sell them simply because they travel really well and they look really pretty on like the grocery store aisles. Meanwhile, like anything with flavor, like heirloom tomatoes and stuff like that, they don't keep. They're good for like a few days on your counter before they start to like burst or rupture or leak, but they have all the flavor.
Yeah, like, it'll be the best tomato you've ever tried. It changes the way you.
We are like dead set in tomato season right now, and I am just so very happy. But yeah.
So I got one thing. So when I was talking about being in Spain and then I came back, I ended up eating at a restaurant, and this was one of those like fine dining restaurants where I think it's important for people to potentially have a high dining experience, especially for me, where I was like contrasted with the tapas. And then I went into this place in Boston called Cleo's. And at the time, I think, what was his name? It was Alexander Talbot, who wrote Ideas in Food. He was
Yeah.
head chef there, and the first thing I ate, it was my first time having a tasting menu and like multi-course, lots of small course kind of things. And the first dish he served was this tomato water martini. And I'm guessing from your expression that you tried tomato water before. If no one
Tomato
has tried
water
this
is
before,
fantastic.
it's unbelievable. You just take a blender full of tomatoes and you blitz them down, and then you run them through cheesecloth like 100 times, or you can also let it settle if you have the right kind of stuff. And what will happen is all of that red, stuff in the tomato will settle out, and you're going to be left with this clear, slightly green liquid that just stinks of tomato. It is like pure tomato umami with none of the acidity, but all of that like fresh
flavor.
Smell and flavor of like, if you touch a tomato plant and it's all over your hands, it's like that translated into this incredibly like viscous, sweet umami liquid.
I'm thinking I remember like the first time I experienced tomato water, and it was like the White Barn in Maine, and it was like it was kind of like this hot and cold soup. So there was like a very, very thick beef consomme, and then they poured the tomato water in there, and like I had it, and you could taste like just the swirl, because the beef consomme was so thick and the tomato water was so thin, but you could just taste
different densities kind of thing. And it was temperature too was different?
The temperature was different too. So it was like just so freaking good. So like the minute that you said, and I haven't made tomato water in a while. It's not, as you said, it's not hard to make, but it is like it's just time consuming. But yeah, the way that I made it once, and I never did it again because I just don't have room in my fridge. But it was just a bunch of tomatoes on a strainer over a cheesecloth in a bucket.
Okay.
And you just let it drip, and that's it. You'll go through a lot, but it's so worth it. Yeah, all of you guys should try it.
Yeah, totally. And I mean, like what we're talking about here, where I had a sip, it was a martini, it was served in a martini glass, and it had a couple drips of olive oil and like a caperberry in it. And I like remember taking that first sip and just being like, whoa, this is like, I've just spent a month eating amazing tapas in Spain, and yet this one sip blew my mind and forever altered the course of my life because I took one bite. In the same way that you described trying that soup and being like, oh my God, there's different textures and densities and these things that, maybe I can't eat like this because it is way too much fucking work to make food like this on a regular basis. But you can integrate that kind of methodology and flavor into your everyday life, which, seeing the food you make, I'm like, clearly you figured out how to make stuff taste like restaurant food, even though you're making fried rice kind of thing, it can be elevating everything. And that's, again, I think a good transition, because I wanted to like get into the anime stuff too, was you make these amazing like food tributes to anime, and I'm not like the world's biggest anime guy, but I did just watch all of Avatar, and I watched Food Wars, which blew my freaking mind. I love that show.
Isn't that just like a crazy niche like that like you'd never think that there was a market for that, and yet this was like such a phenomenon, at the very least in like as far as anime went. And I'm not like a huge like I've watched the essential anime just to be able to stay relevant in a conversation.
Yeah, you've seen Spirit Away. You've seen the things that you need to see.
For sure. I even like watched Naruto, and like that, which is like classic, but at the same time didn't really like it. I just watched it simply. Oh hey, Kojima works. And I just again to stay relevant to the conversation. But Food Wars was just so over the top in every aspect. Like I only heard of it because I watched that one YouTube video of like seeing that lady try that like fake bacon roast, and then she ate it, and then immediately her clothes flew off, and I was like, I need to know what else is going on. I need to know more. And so I did some research, and I found out what it's from. I watched the whole episode, and I was like, I don't know if I want to stay here, but I don't want to leave yet. So,
I was pretty unsure.
Every single one of the manga, because like they took the food so seriously, but that was the only thing they took seriously.
It's well said.
Yeah,
well said. Yeah.
So as a cook and a chef, I respected that. That being
I mean,
said,
yeah,
like,
one of my favorite things was just watching every episode and seeing what they were doing. It was like, well, what would I do for this challenge?
yeah,
You know,
exactly.
because your brain immediately starts clicking. You're like, I have so many ideas how I would approach this challenge, kind of thing.
But at the same time, I would like never recommend this series to any of like my feminist friends or
Yeah,
anything like that.
it has some. I mean, my fiance came in to me watching it, and she's like, "This show's gross. I don't want to be around when you watch it." And then one night she was like working on her computer and was like, "Is it okay if I watch it?" And she saw a few more episodes. And she's like, "Okay, not every food blasts their clothes off." And she's like, "Oh, and the food blows off the guy's clothes too." And I was like, "It does, it does. Not every time, but you know." Yeah, no, there are some troublesome things in there, but like I think if you can concentrate on the food and kind of like the central ethos of like the main character, it really is like inspiring and pretty special.
Which I can't imagine like what like the cross section of fans for a convention would be at the Food Wars booth. Could you just like not that I'd ever want to be
cosplay and weaves and chefs and you know people in their dirty chef's whites and Crocs, you know, mixing up with weaves and people with pillows and stuff. Yeah.
But yeah, onto like why like Food Wars wasn't even like my foray into it. I started using anime as like as kind of like an inspirational source because I know I bashed Chef's Table like not probably like 20 minutes ago, but I got that idea of like taking food, taking inspiration from other sources of art from the Masamune Bottura episode. And like I have nothing ever bad to say about him as a chef. But it was very inspirational seeing somebody like watching like a chef that I respected creatively and in skill go to a museum and derive the next thing that he was going to serve people from like art that he would watch. And I was like, that is amazing. And that it was at that point where I was like, I'm going to stop reading cookbooks from other chefs and start looking for like my external source. And lo and behold, I went to museums, listened to concerts and stuff. But then one day I just decided to like cook the food from Spirited Away for one of my
quail stuff with the black rice.
Yeah, the quail stuff with the black rice. That came from that's one of my favorites. But that came from that show, and I did a 10-course meal tasting menu based on that, and it was very literal because it was like the beginning scene from Spirited Away when they're eating all the food that turns them into pigs. Like those are all real dishes. Spirited Away, the town that Spirited Away is based on actually exists. It's in Taiwan, and it's called Jiufeng, which means seven homes or something. No, 7 portions. And it's literally like this town up in the hills where it's nothing but food stalls that you walk through and you go sampling at every stall. But like alleyways of this town is probably like 2 shoulders wide. Like it's most amazing thing. But yeah, so when I was cooking the food from that, it was very literal, just translating things that I saw into like the dishes I knew how to cook. It had a really good response. And then I eventually once I was starting to cook from other films, there was less to work from. So I started being more conceptual. And the response to that was from the fan base, or the fandom at least, was very well received. And so conceptualizing dishes from animated works just became like a niche that I fell into. Yeah,
it's a cool niche, man. I mean, it's funny for me because I feel like cooking. I in high school and when I was growing up, I did a lot of art. I was in art classes. I was considered going to art school, and ultimately, I kind of decided to go down the science route. But I was missing artistic endeavors and feeling like I was missing a form of expression for a long time. And I realized through college and especially in grad school that I was cooking, and that was my art. And cooking very much was like live jazz in that sometimes it doesn't always sound good. Sometimes things don't taste right, especially when things are coming together and you have raw components and something's like kind of really bitter, a little too salty or whatever it is. But you learn to balance the notes and improvise to riff in real time. And I especially loved kind of the idea of like taking a dish that you've tried somewhere and recreating it, but in your own style. Or like for me, just what happens, I go to the fridge and pull everything out that I'm like, I got to eat this now.
Right.
What can I make? And that's, you know, people who watch my Instagram stories see a lot of the cooking I do, and I'm constantly having people like, hey, send me the recipe. And I'm like, look, man, I documented what I was doing while I was doing it. That's as close as you're going to get, because none of this was based on anything other than, you know, me riffing in my own head.
And a lot of the times when I do like the videos on TikTok for like even the things that I make, the content that I make for TikTok, and they were like, can you drop the recipe, please? And I was like, I can't, because I wasn't writing anything down when I was doing this. I had a goal set in mind, and that's what I pursued. But your mushroom breakfast looks delicious, though. Like, I probably have watched that like 3 times today. I was like, I want a mushroom breakfast. I'm gonna have to do that.
That one overall was a pretty simple one. I think the hard part is when people are like, hey, can you send the recipe? And like, well, I used like part of a stock, which was from something else that had like 30 components on it that was built on top of something else. And it's like, that's a super restaurant-y thing to do, to just kind of spin old food into new food. But because of that, you get these incredible depth of flavor sometimes that you can never recapitulate, because it's really difficult to teach someone every single step that led to that point. Something like a mushroom breakfast should be easy, because you just fry some mushrooms in a pan, throw an egg and like a, you know, piece of ham down, you're good to go. But
did you cook lion's mane in that too?
I did, yeah. And I got I don't, you can see it on like the videos in my TikTok, but I basically have that little greenhouse thing there, and I got a couple of mushroom kits from Far West Fungi, because I helped them do like a promo and give some away. So they sent me a couple. Nice. And it's, for anyone who's interested, it's really easy to grow mushrooms at home. You can do more complicated stuff, but you can just order a kit from online. Most of them are about $20 to $25. It's some amount for shipping. Usually it's worth it to order a couple, so that you're not paying shipping for just one thing.
Right.
And those will usually fruit with anywhere from like 1 to 2 weeks. You'll have mushrooms, and then they'll sort of slowly continue fruiting about half-size mushrooms each time for another month or two.
Oh, so it's like a continuous, like I've always been curious, because I've never done one of those myself, but also like mushrooms, especially like recognizable mushrooms, they're not cheap. Like oyster mushrooms at the farmer's market, like they're not cheap at all, but they're always trying to sell kits. But like I've always been curious as to like what the yield on some of those are. You
don't get your money's worth out of yield worth. I mean, but then again, if you live somewhere where you don't have access to buying something like lion's mane, I think most people in this country have figured out how to get access to oyster mushrooms, at least, because they're in a lot of major grocery stores. The issue is that a lot of major grocery stores don't know how to sell mushrooms and don't know how to keep inventory properly. So you'll go in and they'll just be like oyster mushrooms that are totally desiccated or dried out, and that's on the grocery store. That's not on the supplier.
Right.
But oyster mushrooms too are especially, like, I pick oysters. If I pick them in the morning and I leave them out like till the afternoon, they start looking ratty like that fast.
Yeah.
Which is nice when you have them on a kit, because you can make the decision when to harvest and eat, much like those like heirloom tomatoes, where you're like, I'm going to eat it. It's not going to transport well, but I can eat it now, and that's going to be awesome.
What is your favorite to do as a kit then? Like, because like oysters are pretty common. So it was like but it was like the first mushroom that came to mind for me. But like, as far as like, do they have like more like uncommon ones that?
Yeah, there's some places that have some sort of less common ones. I mean, lion's mane is common, but it's a good one to grow, because especially for a lot of people are like, I don't like mushrooms. I'm like, try lion's mane. It tastes totally different texture. You
did like a fritter or something with them once, didn't you? Or
I did that yesterday. Actually, that was really good. I was gonna say
really,
yesterday.
really
I made tomato water dashi dipping sauce for soba noodles, and I made some like matsutake rice that I put down with sushi, and I rolled up some other stuff. And then I made a little. It was just like some fried lion's mane and some like imitation crab and some maitake and an egg and furikake and some potato starch. Potato starch is like key to getting things like really nice and tacky, and then just coat it in panko and fried it off, kind of thing. And that was a phenomenal little like crab cake kind of thing. But you can do full vegan crab cakes with lion's mane. Probably a pretty similar mix if you took a little bit of potato starch, mixed it with lion's mane and some green onion and that kind of stuff.
Do you have a large vegan following? I imagine you would, because mushroom just has a. I feel like I would have it.
I suppose so. I mean, I'm. People always ask me if I'm vegan or vegetarian. I say that I'm like a passionate omnivore.
Yeah.
But I do eat a lot of mushrooms, and I think it's really important when we think about like sustainability and health and all these other things, that people be more aware of how good mushrooms are for you, and like ideally what your and our our job is to make them look delicious and make people
Right.
want to go out and try them and potentially order. I don't care about them ordering a kit. The financial stuff is like, you're never going to get as much mushrooms out of a kit as you would if you were able to just buy them directly from like a supplier,
Right.
kind of thing. But there's a novelty factor there that's really fun.
I mean, again, like having them fresh when you want it is actually a value in itself, for sure.
Totally. Yeah, it's cool stuff. Man, I'm glad we got a chance to like chat. There's people you see on social media like, I feel like we get along.
Right.
But you live in Detroit, so it's not
you're
like
in
I can't really hit you up for a beer. Yeah, I live in Napa, so it's wine country kind of thing.
That's nice.
It's not bad. I mean, I'll say Napa is a little bit like the Las Vegas of wine. There's a lot of veneers and there's a lot of, tourism and things that happen where people come here because they want to have this like very fancy Napa experience. I've worked at some fancy wineries over the years, so I've seen the guts of every winery, no matter how expensive the bottle price is pretty much the same.
Right.
There's some guy named Jose working in the cellar and he's been there longer than the winemaker or the people up front or anybody, the issue with the wine industry in some ways is a big social justice issue, as is it with all ag, in that, the people who are getting the accolades are often, affluent cis white men. And, there's a little bit more progress with women in the industry, but it's still predominantly old white guys and especially old French white guys and stuff.
And I was there, I think I was there last year with my godmother. And one thing that I had found that was like owning a winery in Napa was like the latest tech toy, like the latest thing for like the rich techie billionaire
Silicon Valley guys.
Yeah.
I mean, and you go to a lot of the wineries and they're like, our owner, and they're like, oh, what's your story? And they're like, well, our owner purchased us 12 years ago because he was a very rich surgeon and he flies here every weekend to party. And you're like, that's not quite what they say, but it's like, no, okay,
you can deduce that.
Cool story, guys. And they're like, well, before that, we were a family winery for like 200 years. You're like, okay, but yeah, you just got bought by some rich guy. Like,
right. No, that was a lot we would come across. The one thing that I remember, which like, unfortunately, it wasn't the wine that I tasted. It was Napa wine it's surprisingly expensive in Napa. So
it is, yeah. So what I always say about wine is like the quality is linear, but the price gets to be exponential.
Yeah.
So as you get more expensive, you will get better, empirically better wines that have been, the grapes are a little bit better. The oak was a little bit better. There's only so much that you can increase quality, whereas the price totally, and part of that problem is that Napa's had this crazy inflation of the price of the grapes, and partially because of the demand for Napa wine.
Yeah.
So like your standard Napa cab, which should probably sell for like $15-20 a bottle, goes for minimum of 50.
Yeah,
they're selling,
we saw a lot of that. Which we actually didn't end up drinking a lot of like local wine when we were there, just because like this is very expensive. But
pretty expensive.
But the thing that I loved most about it was like when I went, it's very hard to go out running over there because there are no like sidewalks because by the grape farms.
I've noticed that, yeah.
But the one thing that like stuck with me was the fact that the air smelled of wine while I was running past some of these vineyards, and I was like, this is the most, like, it's probably something that locals don't even notice anymore, but this was the most amazing like sensation I ever had, was to be able to like smell wine strongly in the air. Was just like, that was like the moment for me.
What time of year were you here?
I was like, it was like after it, like I think it was the fall.
Okay,
it might have been
maybe post-harvest, or
because there were no grapes on there were very few grapes on the vine, so I'm sure they were all processing it at that point. So they were all probably getting like crushed or whatever the proper term is, but
fermenting.
Going but it was the whole thing. It was a delicious smell. I love that.
That's cool. I was gonna say there is a flip side of that, in that like October you get what you're smelling there is like the fermentation esters, all the yeast metabolites that are being vented out of the winery, and you get some amazing fruity wine smells. There's a flip side of it though, in that like 2 or 3 months later, once they've fermented everything out and they've taken all the dreck, all the skins and seeds, and pressed the hell out of them, they take those cakes, which is known as pumice, and toss that back out in the vineyard to help fertilize.
What does
but those things
that probably doesn't smell very good then.
that stinks, and you're driving around like, oh, it's just like poopy wine. No. So that's my association with it, is just the pumice smell rather than that fresh fermentation smell. But it's all here, and it's For me, it was really fun to go from from wine to being suddenly interested in mushrooms, because mushrooms have an incredible variety of aromatic things, and there's
Oh,
so
yeah.
many sort of like sensory and organoleptic components that you would think about with a wine, that you can take the same sort of approach to think about food and mushrooms, and like, and how you pair stuff in that similar way. So like the candy cap mushroom I mentioned.
Yeah. Which
So
I'll
that
probably
has,
be looking up right as soon as this is done, because
and I'll get your address. I'll send you some stuff too. But the sodalon, which is the lactone in there, is also in sherry. So if you pair candy caps and sherry, you have this sort of doubling effect of like the sodalon aromatics and enhancing that maple syrup character. You can also mess around and start adding fenugreek, which also has that sodalon character.
Huh.
Which is one of those things that I really love to think about with food, is like how many things that I can take have similar aromatic profiles and kind of stack them all on top of each other in a dish or a vinegar or a gastrique or something, to generate something that is just like truly the essence of a flavor from like a multi-dimensional kind of way, and then make that a component in a dish. Which is, again, taking that fine dining mentality to just like, hey, I'm going to like sear off a pork chop, and I'm going to put a little bit of this like syrup on top that will make it amazing.
Yeah, that actually makes me think, like, the fact that you mentioned like maple syrup and sherry makes me think of the larpege egg. It's very famous egg dish where it's like they literally just like cut the top of the egg off, they take the white out, put the yolk back in, and then they like just warm it so that just the yolk is just warm, and then they fill that up with creme fraiche, chives, maple syrup, and sherry, and like and then they just eat that with a spoon. So like, yeah, the minute I get that, I'm gonna put that in there. I'm gonna try that. It's a very like look it up after this live. It's a very famous egg dish.
Sounds good.
But
I think I had a riff of that in France once. I was like walking around at a street fair, and someone hands me this egg, and it was like sort of the perfect like sous vide soft boil, like 63-degree yolk with a mousse of foie gras on top of it. And then like a little like piece of like a tiny little dollop of caviar and like a piece of fried leek or something like that. And I just was like literally licking the inside of this egg. Like, how do I get more? God. If I'd spoken better French, I would have been like, guys, you just let me back there.
Right.
Let me mainline this. Do you have I guess, do you have feelings on foie gras? This may upset some vegan followers if anyone's on here, but do you have feelings on foie gras?
I don't really. I mean, like I've seen like how a lot of actually the finer ones are raised, and like they're lining up to the feeder. So
yeah, I've seen that myself too in France as a kid. It was like they walk up to have the gravage done. It's not like they're running away. It's not some evil guy with a tube. It's like the ducks are like, feed me. I want this now.
So it's like, know, I don't know. It's no worse than any other kind of like,
animal husbandry or I don't think it's any crueler than putting chickens in cages and the way that we grow like mass farmed, chickens and eggs in this country.
And on the other hand, at least like the geese and stuff that they use to make foie, they're for like free range.
Yeah, they're free range.
Like the way like they operate in like French fields and stuff. They want their animals to be happy because they feel like they can taste it. I mean, the factory farm thing by and large is like very American, unfortunately. But around, at least here in Michigan, we have like the luxury of being like we're only second to California in when it comes to like output in food and produce. So like I have a really good relationship with all of my like sources of proteins and eggs and stuff. And like a lot of them, we subscribe to like the one bad day rule, where like we all believe like if we're going to use these animals for food, then they should really only have one bad day in their lives.
One bad day.
And so, I mean, it's like the last one, but it's well, they live good lives because, you can taste it. It reflects in the quality and how they're treated.
Totally.
Yeah.
I think for me, what I look at, and this has been sort of my philosophy the last couple of years, is I'm eating a lot less meat than I used to, and not even intentionally. It's been sort of a function of slow evolution and lifestyle change, because I haven't had access to what my friends call happy meat, but what you're talking about, meat that's been sustainably grown, and I can get some stuff at the farmer's market. It costs a little more, so it is motivation to not buy as much. And I mean, also being inspired by guys like Chris Cosentino, I go out and I buy tongue, I buy offal, I buy hooves and joints and things that, you know, might not be immediately tasty, but when I put some technique and some method and stuff into them,
And usually
there's
there's
another
time for parts like that.
yeah, yeah. And there's another TikTok chef, I think Robbie Bell, and he did a thing today where he was talking about like caramel or making this toffee recipe. And he's like, I figured out my hustle in grade school was to like buy cheap sugar and turn it into this. And he's like, I took a, you know, something cheap, added a method to it and made something phenomenal. And I was like, that is such a great way to cook.
Yeah.
Just in general, right? Buy cheap shit,
Yep.
make it taste great. That's a restaurant's ethos. You know, any real restaurant, they don't have that much food waste because they're using all of their trimmings to make soups and stocks and sauces. Yeah. And, you know, that's real restaurant food. There's no waste because everything is getting cycled back in and it tastes amazing. They're also adding a lot of butter to shit, but, but yeah, I mean, what I did this sort of slow lifestyle change of eating less meat because I've been trying to buy the more expensive stuff and focusing more on, and then also I'm integrating a shit ton of mushrooms because I have mushrooms around all the time. You know, even still, I was going to grab a few of these out of the fridge just to sort of show people because they always like to see them. So, you know, it's like hunk of lion's mane, and like that'll stay. You know, my lion's mane will stay good in the fridge for a couple of, you know, at least 2 weeks, kind of thing. Which is another great point. It's like often the mushrooms you get. Not all mushrooms, like these oyster mushrooms get ratty pretty quick, but like some mushrooms will last longer, a lot longer than meat. There's no food safety issues because I'm not worried about like listeria or salmonella or some of the other things.
Right.
And yeah, it's just amazing how like when you're eating a meat dish and there's pieces of mushroom in there, when you're chewing, your brain has a pretty difficult time. You have to sort of stop and be like, that's a piece of mushroom versus that's a piece of meat. Mm-hmm. You know, when you're eating them together, they taste the same. They all in the same sauce. It like, you know, it really, I dropped like 10 pounds over quarantine just because I've been eating so many mushrooms. It's great. I'm not running half marathons. My feet aren't quite there yet, but.
Well, I run the half marathons to balance out the eating mostly.
Yeah. Right. You run so you can eat.
Exactly.
Without, yeah. Yeah, I hear you. That's what I want to do too. But well, cool, man. I don't want to keep it too long, but been fun, been interesting.
This was great. I mean, like, it's really interesting. I think, like, my one issue is unfortunately, like, there's not as much interaction with people in the comments, I guess.
Right, but, and we could have stopped and answered more questions, but I wanted to talk to you more than I wanted to talk to. People asking me what mushroom book they should buy. By the way, if you want to know which mushroom book to buy, because I've seen that question go by a couple times, don't buy books. Go online, there's a great app called iNaturalist. If you really, really, really want to get a book, check my website, fastedbyfungi.com. There's like a frequently asked questions thing, and I've got a couple of books in there that I recommend. The problem is most mushroom ID books are out of date because the names are changing so quickly.
That's interesting. I didn't know that.
Yeah. There's a huge taxonomic revolution happening with mushroom names because everything's being DNA sequenced. Uh-huh. And so previously all mushrooms were organized they were put in families together based on how they looked. Yeah. And so like everything that had teeth was supposed to be related. And then they found out like, oh shit, mushrooms have evolved teeth like 8 different times, or like gills have been evolved like, you know, a bunch of different times. So there's all these sort of examples of convergent evolution where things look morphologically similar,
but they're not at all related.
Exactly. Completely different evolutionary backgrounds. And so that's being corrected a little bit right now. But because of that, it's almost confusing because usually it was that like, oh, don't use common names, always use the scientific names to be sure what you're talking about. Now it's like, well, you can say scientific names, but like that might have changed like 4 times. So like sometimes the common names are almost more consistent because they haven't been changing quite as quickly.
Right. That's really interesting. I had no idea that was going on. Yeah.
I mean, it's, you know, all sorts of revolutions of technology and stuff. I mean, we could go on and on about like, you know, what it is to see mushrooms in the future and sustainability and how like I think chefs have almost a duty to help people understand how important it is to eat mushrooms because they're so much more sustainable. Like,
right. As far as like their carbon footprint and how easy they are to like produce and grow and what they require as far as resources. Yeah, I do believe like eventually down the road that everybody will technically, like once we're able to like grow meat or like print meat the way that they're investing in doing right now, we're gonna, except for maybe even the most like the smallest of markets, technically everybody is going to be vegan in our lifetimes. I could see that happening where it's like animals won't be our protein source, but at the same time we'll still be eating beef in a way. You're seeing
Yeah.
already, like with like investment into like Impossible Foods and stuff like that.
Impossible, yeah. And I used to, like, when I was technical sales the last couple of years, so I went down to Impossible a couple of times, got a chance to like be on their factory floor and see some of the stuff they were working on. And there is phenomenal investment and innovation going on there. But I think one of the things that people are losing sight of is like we're creating these meat alternatives. They're not really any better than meat.
Yeah.
You know, it's not, nutritionally, it's no better for you.
Yeah.
Arguably almost worse potentially. But there's, you know, the things exist already. Like mushrooms are the perfect meat alternative. You don't need to engineer them as food. You just need to grow them.
And that's one thing that I get into a lot when I like speak on my channel, where people was like, oh, can you like talk more about plant-based foods, or like can you give us more plant-based recipes? It's like when it comes to like fruits and vegetables and fungi and mushrooms, like I as a person enjoy these things for what they are and not for what they can like potentially replace. So like I don't eat tofu for any other reason for the enjoyment of tofu, or like
tofu. I love, I mean, I grew up, I think one of the reasons that we get along is because I grew up with a Taiwanese babysitter. And so for the first like 4 or 5 years of my life, I was eating Taiwanese food all the time. My parents are, you know, Canadian. They're white bread kind of people. I mean, they're fairly advanced culinary people now, but they grew up on boiled vegetables and Irish stuff and whatever. Right. But I had this great exposure early in life to lots of really flavorful foods, and I love tofu. And I remember like suddenly coming to a point when tofu kind of got trendy, and everyone's like, "Oh, we're gonna make a tofu burger," and I tried to like, "This is terrible."
Right.
Like,
someone tried to convince me like tofu scrambled eggs was a good thing. I was like, "This is awful. This is."
Oh yeah, no. Yeah, I had a lot of vegan friends
and like that's what I believe when it comes to like vegetables and fruits. Mm-hmm. And like I could go vegan and easily enjoy it should I wanted to, but I won't be doing it because I'm trying to substitute meat dishes with other things that just aren't meat. No.
Right. And if you look at like traditional Chinese cooking, when you make a tofu dish, there's always a tiny bit of ground pork in there.
There is. You know? There is. Like mapo tofu. I went to like one like more westernized kind of Chinese restaurant where they have their mapo tofu was vegan. I was like, this is awful. I don't understand how you can no.
Yeah. I think in theory you could probably do something like take some lion's mane that had been like heavily seasoned and like maybe smoked it a little bit and added some like exogenous like good coconut fat or something that you really infused flavor into.
You had to definitely approach it with the intention of replacing that ground meat with something, but you can't just do it just the tofu and the oil.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. No, I'm 100% with you, and that's a great reminder just for people. It's like you don't necessarily need to go vegan, but you can reduce. You don't need like three ounces of protein a day to survive, kind of thing. So you don't need a 12-ounce steak.
Protein.
Yeah. And I still like sometimes I'll even cook what's basically vegan, but I'll use just a little bit of bacon in the base, kind of thing. You know, just to everything else is vegetables, everything else is mushrooms. There's no other animal fats, but just that little bit kind of like brings it to where I want it to be.
Right.
And, with any recipe, you could easily knock that out and use some other plant-based fats and stuff like that. And just, from a culinary perspective, you need to think about fats too, not as your enemy and like totally as your friend, right? That's where vitamins and flavors and everything go into. So
people are only starting to realize that fats aren't that big of a, like, unless you're like cholesterol is something that you're looking out for, fats really aren't as much of the enemy as we were led to believe.
Well, we were led there, like horses to water by like the sugar and flour industry in like the 70s, being like, fats are bad, eat lots of carbs. And like, wait, we're all obese. What's wrong? We all have diabetes. Shit. So yeah, no, I think mushrooms are a big part of that nutrition thing, and it doesn't necessarily need to be plant-based, but I'm happy to like help people think about how to eat more mushrooms and stuff. Yeah. Totally.
Which I think, like I said, plant-based in one way, shape, or form is like the future of like, especially when it comes to sustainability.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think with the people are really excited about the idea of like lab-grown meat. Having seen some of that stuff firsthand, I think it's going to be a while, because the big challenge a lot of people don't realize is that almost all lab-grown meat, while they can do it conceptually, is lacking structure and scaffolding. So they're not able to recapitulate muscle tissue. So it's basically just goo on it, like muscle goo on a plate. And then everything that they use to grow them on is still derived from animals. They use what's called serum But
Yeah.
guess what? Serum is just blood. It's clarified blood, plasma and stuff like that. So until we get to a point that we're really truly able to grow meat on like a plant-based media, and we can grow it with structure, and we can recapitulate all these other things, I think we're going to see tons and tons of like plant-based replacements. And again, the replacements are okay, but like we've talked about, like usually it's better to just cook real whole foods, but apply your method, take the cheap shit, apply the methods in the cooking, and then make something that's really phenomenal, without having to go out and buy this like heavily processed with tons of sodium and sodium benzoate and all these other things in there that are like dubiously good for your health kind of thing. So,
Right.
Cool, man. Well, I hope when COVID is somewhat over that maybe I can come out to Detroit and maybe I can like check out one of your pop-ups. So
yeah, no, that would be great, and have you over. We could like do a dinner together or something here. That would be super fun. I do collaborations with people over here all the time, and maybe I'd have a place for you to stay once the house is done.
That sounds cool. Yeah, I saw you walking around your sort of shell of a house, I guess, but. Yeah. Good stuff. Well, you know what? If you're ever back in Napa, let me know. You're always welcome to stay here and grab some. I can take you some good wineries that aren't as overpriced. Usually, when people are like, "Hey, I'm going to visit Napa. Where should I go?" I'm like, "Don't go to Sonoma. Go to the wineries in Sonoma. They're cheaper and they're still happy to see you." Instead of Napa being like, "Ooh, do you have a reservation?" You know. Cool, man. Well, it's been fun, and maybe we'll set it up again. But yeah. Stuff.
That would be great. All right, see ya.
Adios. Yeah. Hey, thank you everyone who stuck around, and sorry we didn't answer that. Oh, I guess we could answer a couple of questions before we go here, just to make sure. Yeah, sure. Sorry, guys. With the books that John was mentioning, I don't know what. Oh, yeah. I actually want to write those down. Tell me the names of those authors again who wrote the really good Chinese cookbooks.
So the first one, I mean, the one Fuchsia Dunlop, Fuchsia as in the colors.
Yeah, Fuchsia.
CHSIA.
Yeah.
Dunlop, DUNLOOP. Oh, Dunlop. Just one O.
Not Dunloop.
Yeah, not Dunloop. And for hers, she's got a bunch of really, really great ones. But I enjoyed Revolutionary Cooking. That was her like Hunan food one. And then Eileen Tan. And then hers, I don't have it with me, but it's like, you know what? Give me like 5 seconds.
Yeah, no worries. So anyone else who was wondering about the books that I mentioned, I was talking about Ideas in Food, which is by Ali and Alexander. And they have, I think they've got a thing going now called Curiosity Donuts. They were also making pasta for a while. This is some really interesting, if you're like a food nerd, this is a good book for you. If you are an aspiring food nerd, then I definitely recommend On Food and Cooking by Harold McGee. This is pretty much like the Bible of food science. It's literally like a book they use it as a textbook at UC Davis when they're teaching food science. So it's a good one.
So I found one by a different Eileen Yinfei Lo, and then that one is Mastering the Art of Chinese Cooking, and that one is a very, very good one to start with.
Okay.
Yeah. And then Fuchsia Dunlop, Revolutionary Kitchen, I think, and then Every Grain of Rice is a very good one as well.
Okay, cool. And yeah, for anyone who doesn't recognize like Chinese, you think that French food has like a lot of methods and a lot of techniques, and French food is the pinnacle of fine dining. Wait until you understand Chinese food in its full depth, because I have like just scratched the surface, and your mind gets blown.
The difference, like if you're gonna compare it to anything, like I know like Italian regionalism is a really, really big thing, like how the differences between like Northern Italian and like China is massive, and there are like 8 different like cuisine. There are more, but like 8 respected and like quintessential cuisine styles, and they are so different from each other as far as like anything from spice level to like the flavor. Like northern Chinese has a lot of like curry and Muslim influence and stuff, like delicious food, but not at all like each other. So.
Yeah, no, it's very, from the south to the north, and you see complete differences in rice versus noodles, and animal fats versus butter. There's so many things, and China's huge too. So yeah, it's amazing to get a chance to talk to you, and hopefully we'll do again. So
yeah, thank you so much.
bye guys. Thanks everybody for joining. Cheers.